Hi, everyone, and welcome back for Chapter 7 of Psych 3510. In this chapter, we are going to be discussing sampling methods, or basically different methodologies you can use to gather your participants. So this seems like a very simple endeavor, right? Let's just ask people to come be a part of the study. But it gets very complicated because the manner in which you procure your participants, the manner in which you get people to be in the study, has substantial implications for the conclusions that you can draw from your study, as well as maybe the strength of your study, right? Its validity, essentially. So I want to give you sort of a quick warning before we start this chapter. There's a lot of terminology. We're going to go through a list of, I think, 7 or 8 different sampling methods. They all have their own sort of name and definition, and so it's going to be a lot of words, a lot of terms coming out of this chapter. So just keep that in mind as you're studying and as you're watching, because we really want to make sure we are accurately distinguishing between these terms, these sampling methods, particularly when some of them might sound kind of the same. They sound similar. So just keep that in mind as we move through the chapter. So we're going to really be talking about 2 large issues in this chapter. The first is generalizability, which we've mentioned in the past. Basically, is your sample representative of the population? And if so, which population, right? How did you define your population? And is your sample representative of that population? As we discussed previously, this has to do with the idea of external validity, meaning to whom do your findings apply? And it's pretty self-evident that the people that you use for your experiment has implications for making conclusions about to whom the experimental findings might apply. And that's interrogating external validity. And so we're going to discuss, a lot more details about generalizability, and then sort of compare generalizability to our interrogation of external validity, meaning we're going to ask the question, when does generalizability matter most? And when can perhaps we get away with not having the most representative sample possible? So to discuss generalizability, we have to define and discuss a few different terms: populations versus samples. And then we're going to answer the question, when can samples, or when are samples biased, by distinguishing between 2 major categories of sampling: probability sampling techniques, where the manner in which we procure participants has some element of randomness or probability to it, versus unrepresentative samples or biased sampling techniques. So we're going to take sort of each of these issues in turn. We're going to spend the majority of this lecture on generalizability and these different types of sampling techniques. So first things first, a population is the entire set of people or things that you are interested in learning something about. Your population could be as broad as all humans. Right? That's going to sometimes be the case in psychology, but often that's not feasible in psychology, because we know that things like race, ethnicity, religion, age, country of origin, income, upbringing, right, parenting, those things matter a lot for individual level psychology variables. So it's not too often in psychology where we get to make the claim, this applies broadly to all people. We can get close often, and generally the more biological your question, the more generalizable it can be, right? The sort of larger set of people it can apply to. So we might have a general rule that something like neuroscience is going to be more generalizable than something like social psychology. Right? Social psychology is the study of social behavior, which is often dependent upon things like culture or upbringing. So it might be less generalizable, whereas something like neuroscience or cognitive neuroscience might be a little more generalizable because the study of the brain might apply to larger swaths of people or the population. So population is the set of people you are interested in studying. You can define that in any way you want. Like I said, it can be all humans. It could be teenagers. It could be Americans. It could be men. It could be, homosexual women living in Alaska, right? Like whatever your population of interest is, you can define it as broadly or as constrained as you would like to define it. Your sample is the subset of people that you take from that population in order to collect data from. So it would be very rare to have a census, which is the ability to sample every single member of the population, right? That's what we call, that's why we call the thing we do every 10 years in the United States, where we count up how many people live, in every state and every county, and we distribute things like federal resources and seats in the House of Representatives, right? Things like that are dependent upon a census where we take count or get as close as possible to counting every single person in the population, where we define the population as people living in the United States of America. Right? So that's why we call that the census, because a census is when you sample every member of a population. But as you can imagine, that's extremely difficult, right? Just look at our census, the government census that we do. It's going to be very difficult to be perfect, right? To get every single person. Good luck with that. And it takes time, money, resources, an extravagant amount of those things. So a census is pretty rare in research, especially psychological research. And so what we tend to work with are samples, which is a smaller subset of people that we take from the population. So if my population of interest is, Georgia State students, it's unlikely that I have the time or resources to collect data from every single Georgia State student. What's going to be more likely is that I collect a sample of maybe 200 or 300 or 500 Georgia State students. And then what I hope is that the stuff I learn about that smaller sample applies to the population. So we can think of the population as the larger group of interest, and then we sample out a smaller subset of that population, and this is who we actually do the research with, right? It's basically impossible to do research with your entire population, so we're left with doing research of a subsample of that population. Now, because of that, there is a sort of logical or philosophical difficulty, because step 2 is that we collect our data with this small sample of participants, and then we're going to take our findings from this group and we're going to make inferences about the population. We're going to make claims about the population, even though we don't have data on the population. And that's sort of the crux of sampling, is this arrow of inference going back to the population, because I'm finding something with this group of people, and then I'm taking that finding and I'm making the larger claim that it applies also to all of these people for whom I never collected data. So I'm going to draw a conclusion about a group of people from whom I have no data, because I'm using a subset of that population and I'm inferring that what is true for the subset is also true for the population. That's a logical leap, right? And that is the thing that gives us difficulty here, because that logical leap has the potential for errors to be made, right? It is easily conceivable that something I find with a small group of people, right? I find that in this small sample of people, your GPA predicts your rates of depression, right? That's what I find. In this small subsample of people, your GPA predicts your rates of depression. It's very possible that that finding does not apply to the population, that the inference of going to the population would actually be an error, because in fact there was something different or special about my sample to make it unrepresentative of the population or to make it biased. And so that's the danger here. The danger is that we sample in such a way, we pull people out of the population in such a way that that sample is systematically different from the population. Thus, we have a biased sample, an unrepresentative sample, and whatever result we find with our sample does not actually apply to the population, even though we are making that inference. So, my population is Georgia State students. I sample 200 of them, and I find that GPA predicts rates of depression. But it turns out that I did my sampling by only collecting data from students who are in intensive tutoring classes, let's say. Right? Only students who are in these tutoring classes. And I happen to run the tutoring classes, and so I have easy access to them. And so I collect data from 200 people. I'm claiming that this result is going to apply to all Georgia State students, but there is something systematically different about my 200 participant sample. They were all getting tutoring. And it's possible that there is something special or different or biased about the students getting tutoring that make them not representative of the population, and thus make my finding one in which I should not be making an inference back to the population. I would be making an error to apply that back to the larger group. So this chapter is about defining the different ways that we can sample participants so that we understand the potential pitfalls in each of those sampling methods and how they might be biased or might be unbiased. Okay. So, as I said before, a sample is biased when there is something systematically different about it. So let's imagine that you're a psychologist that studies political ideology or political behavior, and you want to survey people who are registered Democrats. Right? That's your population of interest. You have some research question about the opinions of registered Democrats. So you think, oh wow, well there's a rally for a Democratic candidate that's coming up. What a great opportunity to go collect my data, right? Because what's happening is that all of these people who are presumably going to be more likely to be a registered Democrat because they are showing up at a Democratic rally, they're all gathering in one place. That's super convenient for me. Let me just go there and collect my data from them because it'll be easier, right? There's a whole bunch of registered Democrats all in one place. Let me just survey them there. So that seems like a really, really good idea. And it is if what you're focused on is convenience. But I would argue that this is going to be a biased sample. Even though all of these people are likely to be registered Democrats, within the population of registered Democrats, there might be something different about the people who are willing to go to the rally, right? There are a bunch of registered Democrats who are not going to go to the rally. And so I would argue that the ones who are willing to go to the rally, who are willing to take the time, who are willing to incur the expense, who are motivated enough, who might take off work, right, in order to go to the rally. That is going to make them a systematically different type of person than the general population of registered Democrats. So what you're likely to get at a political rally are the most gung-ho, the most motivated, maybe the slightly more extreme people in their personal beliefs and ideologies about that political party. What you're likely to miss are the more moderate people, or the less motivated people who are still registered Democrats and are still planning on voting for a Democratic candidate, but they just didn't make the effort to go to the rally because, it's just not as important to them. And so even though this seems like a great idea, you are opening yourself up to an incredibly biased sample, such that the data you collect from the people at the rally might not apply to all people registered for that political party. So a sample is biased whenever it systematically differs from the population of interest, and that's a problem because we are using that sample to draw conclusions about the population. Okay, so here in this chart, we have 3 examples of a population of interest, and then a biased sampling technique, and then an unbiased sampling technique. So let's stick with this first example. I want to survey Democrats in Texas. So a biased sampling technique would be going to the Texas Democratic Convention and sampling people there, or even more biased would be recruiting people who sit in the front row, right? Who gets front row seats? People who are probably donors, who know somebody, who are related to the candidates, who are involved in the party leadership, right? So if we sample people sitting in the front row, we might have an especially biased sample. A better way to obtain data, a more unbiased way to obtain data on Democrats in Texas, is to get a list of all registered Democrats from public records and then randomly call some of them on the phone, right? Or send out mailers, right? That's going to be a little better than going to the convention, because presumably in this unbiased sampling technique, all of the Texas Democrats have an equal opportunity to be included in my sample. And that's going to be a key here for the idea of probabilistic sampling and representative sampling. That all Texas Democrats, so everyone in my population of interest, would have an equal opportunity to be in the sample if I'm just randomly cold calling them, right? Drivers, a bias sampling technique might be asking drivers to complete a survey when they stop to add coins to a parking meter. This is going to be biased because these are people who are in a particular location at a particular time of day. They might be, who's likely to need to put money in a parking meter? Maybe someone who's visiting from out of town, who doesn't have an office or a home or a parking space, or know the area well enough to know where to go park for free. It might be someone who's out running an errand or shopping or has a meeting that they're going to be in and out really quick. So there are many ways in which sampling people with that method might be biased, versus an unbiased technique, which would be get a list of all the licensed drivers in the state and then randomly select them using a random number generator and contact them for data. So notice what makes these unbiased is the addition of some kind of randomness, some kind of probabilistic technique that gives everyone the same opportunity to be included, versus these samples or these sampling techniques, which are going to have sort of idiosyncratic nuances to who is chosen to be in the sample. Okay, so there are broadly 2 classes of sampling techniques. We can think of one class of sampling techniques as being biased or unrepresentative of the population, these are going to not include randomness or probability. That is sort of the core of what makes them biased, is that these 4 sampling types, convenience, purposive, self-selected, and snowball, are not going to involve probability or randomness, versus our other class of sampling methods, the representative samples, which are going to include at least some element of probability or randomness. Now, there are good reasons why you might choose one of these biased sampling techniques, and we're gonna talk about and discuss those. And there are good reasons why you might choose a particular representative sample, right? These are not all created equally. They each have their own advantages and disadvantages and situations where you might need to use them. But if you are stuck, right, we prefer not to use a biased sample. But if you are stuck using a biased sample, then you need to at least sort of make amends for that in other ways in your experimental design, or acknowledge it when you're drawing conclusions. You have to say, we recognize that this was a convenience sample and that has XYZ problems, and so that might impact our conclusions in XYZ ways, right? As long as you're open and honest, then it's okay, right? But you can't ignore the fact that you have used a biased sampling method. So let's dive into them. Biased sampling techniques. So we have convenient sampling, purposive sampling, snowball sampling, self-selected sampling, and then I'm going to add a 5th one, quota sampling. So a convenient sample is just what it sounds like. You reach out to people who are easy to contact. They're just there, right? This is often a critique in experimental psychology, because many experiments in the field of psychology use college students who are taking Psych 100, right, or Intro to Psych, because that class has maybe a built-in research requirement where you have to participate in research in order to get a certain number of points or to pass the class. And so it allows researchers to have a constant pool of participants, but in reality, that's just convenience. You're just sampling them because they're there. And that's okay. We just have to acknowledge that convenience sampling has some problems. It has some issues. To investigate those issues, let's look at this example. Let's say this is actual data from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. That's the large arm of the U.S. government that's over, for example, things like the CDC. These data were collected from almost 16,000 participants, so that's really good. It's a big sample. And they wanted to know about people's health behaviors. 3 main questions were asked. Are you a current smoker? Have you had at least one heavy drinking day in the past year? And I'm sure they defined heavy drinking, right, as something like 4 or more drinks or 5 or more drinks in the same day. And then have you received the influenza vaccine in the past year? So these are 3 target questions. And the HHS reached out to people who either had a landline only or landline plus wireless, meaning cell phone, household, right? So we're cold calling people, and then we're asking them also, do you have a landline only, or do you have a landline and a cell phone? Versus people who only have a cell phone, right? Wireless only household. Versus people who have no phone whatsoever. So we can see that at the time, this is 2015, the population is basically split almost 50-50 between people who only use a cell phone or have a landline plus a cell phone. There aren't that many people out there who just have a landline anymore. Even my 90-year-old grandfather has a cell phone. He doesn't always keep it turned on, but he's got it when he needs it. Versus only about 3% of households who have no phone at all. What's interesting is that these data show us that health behaviors differ based upon these categories. So, if you have a landline and a wireless phone, only 11.5% of people are smokers. If you only have a cell phone, 18.8% of people are smokers. If you have no phone at all, almost 21% of people are smokers. People with a landline or wireless or cell phone, 17% of them have had a heavy drinking day. Almost 30% of just cell phone users have had a heavy drinking day. And only 24% of no phone households have had a heavy drinking day. And you can see the numbers also differ for the flu vaccine, influenza. So who cares, right? I mean, it's kind of a weird thing. Why would these things differ based on your phone status? And we don't really care why they differ. I mean, we can hypothesize about why they differ. Things like age, right? Who's likely to have a landline? Probably people who are older, right? People maybe above, at this point, probably 45 or 50 are maybe more likely to have a landline. I would imagine if you're 40 or under, you're much less likely to have a landline. Things like that. Who are people who have no phone? I would imagine if you have no cell phone and you have no landline, you're much more likely to be low income probably than someone who has a cell phone or a cell phone and a landline. So there are some demographic differences, I would say age and income, that are going to systematically differ based on the method of contact, based on the way in which someone can get in contact with you. So what that means is that, for example, if for convenience, we got a bunch of cell phone numbers from Verizon and we used that database of cell phone numbers to collect our data, it is going to systematically differ from had we called a landline. Maybe, we used the phone book, which is like free and available and convenient, right? So we only call people on landlines. Our data are going to systematically differ from everyone else's data. And so we need to be careful about just using the most convenient method of collecting data, because that method of convenience might have implications for the data. For example, Amazon has a system called Mechanical Turk. We just call it MTurk. It is a way for researchers to get data from people who are paid to do experiments or to do surveys. And so this is a way for people to earn extra money by providing their data. It's a way for researchers to get easy access to people over the internet in a super convenient way. But clearly, there might be some problems with this sampling method. People who are willing to spend their time and efforts completing survey after survey after survey after survey online might be systematically different from people who are not willing to do so. Maybe these people are doing this as a second income. Maybe they need money. Maybe they just have free time that they're trying to fill. They're going to differ from people who do not do this. So convenient samplings are problematic because the act of the convenience is going to give us a biased sample. Okay. Purposive sampling. This is one that you often end up needing to do, and it is a sort of necessary evil in data collection to engage in purposive sampling. We just have to recognize that it's somehow biased. So in purposive sampling, researchers recruit only the types of people they want to study, which seems fine, right? Within your population, but they do it in a non-random way by sort of purposefully going after particular types of those people. So, for example, we want to study alcoholism. I could either attend AA meetings and recruit participants, right? Again, this is similar to our Texas Democrats example, right? We're going directly to the source, right? AA meetings. I want to study alcoholics. Alcoholics go to AA meetings. Let's go to an AA meeting and collect data. I've actually done that before. I have a decent data set on actually opioid addicts that we used AA meetings to recruit them, because oftentimes opioid addicts are also alcoholics. And so I engaged in purposive sampling for that data set. Because this is going to be non-random, because alcoholics that attend Alcoholics Anonymous are alcoholics who are trying to control their alcoholism, right? Generally, right? I think that's a general statement that we can make. These are either alcoholics who are sober for a short period of time or a long period of time, or these are alcoholics who are attempting to get sober, right? We know in general that the average addict relapses a few times right before it sticks, if it's going to stick. So at an AA meeting, we have people who are recovering addicts who are sober, or addicts who are attempting to get sober. Who are we missing? We're missing all of the addicts who are not attempting to get sober, right? All of the other addicts out there in the world who are just in the throes of their addiction and living life, or who are really deep down in the hole of addiction and are really having problems such that they're not even able or willing to go to an AA meeting, for example. Or you're missing people who we might define as like functional alcoholics, people who probably meet the textbook definition of alcoholism, but they don't feel like alcoholics because they're still able to manage their disease. They're still able to function in the world. And so they're like, I don't need to go to AA, right? I have a job, I have a family, I'm doing well. I'm not an alcoholic, even though we would probably, if you got an honest array of their behaviors, we would define them as alcoholics. So you're only getting a biased subset of your population, only the alcoholics who are willing to go to AA meetings, versus maybe we somehow get a data set with 5,000 phone numbers, and we call those phone numbers until we have enough alcoholics. Now, of course, we have the same problem we had back here with convenience sampling, right? But we can do things, right? We could make sure that we're calling an equal number of cell phones or landlines. We could try to mitigate those issues in a way to make a little bit to make the randomness at least a little bit better. So this one is purposive sampling, because I'm going directly after my participants at maybe a place or in a situation that is going to bias them. So if you wanted to study people's exercise behaviors and you went to a gym to collect data, that would be purposive sampling, and it's biased because you're studying people's exercise behaviors who are willing and able to go to a gym. And those people are going to be different from all of the other people exercising who don't go to gyms. Maybe they have gyms at home. Maybe they just run, right? So they don't need to go to a gym. Maybe they do yoga, so they're at yoga studios. They're not in a gym, right? So this sort of purposeful seeking out of a time or a place to study your population in a way that's going to bias your study. Okay. Snowball sampling. Snowball sampling is when we collect data with participants, and then we ask those participants to recommend people they know who might also be participants. So You come in, you do a study in the lab. We say, oh, hey, by the way, we're looking for some more data. Would you mind letting your friends know? Or we're collecting data on college students who are in fraternities or sororities, right? Who are involved in Greek life. Would you mind going back to your sorority and handing out these flyers and letting everyone know that we're collecting data so that they can, come be in our study? Right? So you're asking participants to recommend people they know to also become participants. This is clearly non-random because the people that you know and interact with are more likely to be of a certain type of person, right? So let's think about political opinions. If I'm studying politics, this would be a terrible idea because particularly in a very hotly contested and divided political environment, we are unfortunately often find ourselves in a time where people don't reach across the aisle very often in their friendships. It's kind of a tough situation in which to be. Like, I would imagine a lot of people are not really close friends with someone who has completely opposite political views of them, right? If you think about your really close friends, there are probably people who think similarly to you, believe similar things to you. And so if we snowballed using you, we'd end up with more people who thought like you, right? And so that's going to bias our sample. Now, there are occasions when we might want to use snowball sampling. Those occasions are few and far between, but there are legitimate reasons for using snowball sampling. Situations like studying incredibly rare or difficult to get access to situations. So imagine that you're a social psychologist and you study group behavior. In particular, you want to study cults, right? How do people get involved in cults? What are the social dynamics and the group dynamics of being in a cult? Those sorts of things. A perfectly legitimate source of inquiry. Cults are notoriously, almost by definition, right, difficult to get access to. And so if you can get access to one or two people in a cult and you can ask them to then refer more people for the data collection, you might have some better luck, right, than doing a random sample. Imagine that you're studying a very rare autoimmune disease. And so you find people who have that autoimmune disease, and then you say, hey, by chance, through your doctor, maybe through a help group, maybe through an online, Facebook group, do you happen to have access to other people with this rare autoimmune disease? And would you mind passing along our information so that hopefully they'll come participate in the study? So those are perfectly legitimate situations in which to use snowball sampling. Basically, incredibly rare situations where it's difficult to get access to participants. We'd prefer not to use snowball sampling. But again, if you use it, you have to acknowledge that it's non-random and it's likely to be potentially biased. But in these situations of rare questions and rare people, maybe we don't care so much because we want to study that autoimmune disease. And it's more important that we study it and get data on it than it is to ensure that we have the most perfect randomized probabilistic sample, right? Maybe getting the data is more important than not getting the data. Next, we have self-selection. It's pretty obvious what self-selection is. It's a little clear. It's people who choose to participate. They volunteer their opinions. This is the Yelp phenomena, right? It's if you've ever been to a website and you get a little pop-up window that's like, hey, would you mind giving us your thoughts on this? It's the Amazon review phenomena. It's people who are self-selecting. They're choosing to volunteer to participate in such a way as they are going to be different from other people. So, for example, this is a little pop-up window that's pretty common to see on a website. Maybe this is a developmental psychologist or a pediatrician who's trying to collect data on safety behaviors in people with children, mainly car seats. And so, for safety's sake, the American Academy of Pediatrics says kids should ride in a rear-facing car seat until they've outgrown the height or weight limit around the age of 2 or 3. Do you plan to follow this advice? And we see that the answers are sort of a resounding, almost 60% of people say yes. That's actually kind of terrible. We would hope that it's higher. We would hope that people would follow that advice more. But people are just volunteering to vote in this. So who's likely to vote in this? Maybe people that have strong opinions about car seats. Maybe people who are very close to being new parents rather than thinking about having children, right? Maybe people who already have children rather than people who are expecting a child. So there are many different sort of aspects or variables that might influence a particular person to self-select into answering this question, and that self-selection might bias the data. Again, how many 3-star Amazon reviews do you see? How many 3-star Yelp reviews do you see? They're generally either 5 stars or 1 star, right? It's people who had an amazing experience or it's people who had a terrible experience, because those are the people who are motivated to self-select into providing these data. So self-selection based on just volunteering from masses of people is a biased sampling method. It's advantageous because we can get lots of data, especially using something like this on the internet. We can get lots of data really, really quickly, but we also have to be careful about, the bias that might be in that data. And then quota sampling is biased. This one is I'm just gonna throw it out there, is going to be kind of difficult to distinguish from some of the sampling methods we're going to hear about later. So just sort of stay on your toes about how to distinguish between this one and some of the others. So quota sampling is when we identify subsets of the population and then set target numbers for acquiring participants in each category. So maybe I am trying to collect data on minority racial categories, right? So I want to collect data on African-American students, Asian students, and Latina students at Georgia State. So I attend maybe the club fair and recruit students to be in my study who are members of clubs that are sort of focused around these racial groups. And I do that until I have 50 students from each group. And then that's who I collect my data from. So this is a biased sampling method because it's not representative of the population, right? So in this case, I would have 50-50-50 in my 3 racial groups. That's 150 students, evenly divided, right? A third, a third, a third. But these racial groups do not all equally make up 1/3 of the population, right? This is by definition not representative of the population. So it's biased. But again, I might not care about that as the researcher. My research goal might be to gather data on these particular types of students. I don't care that it's not representative. It is inherently biased and unrepresentative because it doesn't represent the general Georgia State population at large. But maybe I'm okay with that, right? Maybe I want to focus on these particular racial or ethnic groups and students, and I'm okay with biasing the data because I want to make sure that I have enough of each of these groups. Again, sort of put a pin in this one. We'll see how it compares to some of our similar sounding, similar feeling biased sampling methodologies. Okay, so let's wrap up with biased samples by talking about when we might be okay. We've sort of talked about it throughout, but when might we be okay with using a biased sample? You know, sometimes you just have limited time and resources and you can only do so much. And, you know, you need the data. And so you don't have millions of dollars or, you know, hundreds of employees to go out and collect the data for you. And so you have to compromise by using a biased sampling method. We also might be okay with using a biased sampling method if external validity is not important to our research question. This is the exemplified by the quota sampling method. You know, I don't care about applying this to all Georgia State students. I am explicitly interested in African American, Asian, and Latina students. That's it, right? That's who I care about the data from. I don't care about applying this equally to everyone else. So external validity is not important to my research question. Having a perfectly proportional representative sample doesn't matter to me because that's not the point. And so you might be okay with using a particular biased sample. So these biased or non-probability or unrepresentative sampling techniques aren't necessarily bad. You will see them commonly used and they exist. That's why we're talking about them. They just have limitations when it comes to generalizability, and we need to be aware of those limitations, and we have to acknowledge them and consider them when we make that second arrow, right? When we make that inference back to the population. We have to be able to critique. Are you making a correct or a valid inference? Are you inferring too much from your biased sample? Are you inferring to the wrong population, right? That's something that could happen. You have a sample that's non-representative, and then you make an inference to a representative sample or a representative population. So this is one of those things where it's okay to do. You just have to lay all your cards on the table. You just have to be honest about the method that you've used and the limitations that come with that method. Okay, that's a good place to stop for part one. We're going to pick up part two with our discussion of representative sampling techniques. Thanks, everybody, and I'll see you later.